I used to work at a Walmart. The Walmart I worked at was open 24 hours. Due to my kid's school schedule, I would work overnight shifts so that I would be available to drop him off and pick him up. I would do a 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift every night. During the day, I'd sleep, take care of my son, and work my second job. Some days, I was exhausted a lot. During this time in my life, it wasn't a great time. I had to do what I could to cover rent, though. This Walmart was one of the bigger ones. It was a supercenter, not just a grocery store, so it had everything. When I got there around 10 hours on this one cold night, there was still a decent amount of shoppers in the store. A lot of people would come in for some late-night shopping. As the hours would pass, it would, of course, quiet down tremendously. The late hours of the night would attract a lot of weirder characters, weirder than the usual ones during the day. Into the AM hours of the night, there was only one person working the front of the store, and he or she would be at the self-checkout registers. There were no regular registers open this late. There would also be a couple of stock workers on the floor, which was what I did. Then there would be a couple of warehouse workers in the back who I really didn't ever interact with. They did their own thing, and then there's just the night manager on duty. I was in the cereal aisle doing my usual stock work. I noticed a customer walk past the aisle. Then, seconds later, he stepped back into view at the end of the aisle, stopped, and looked down at me. When I looked back at him, he started looking at the cereal. The guy had curly hair. I couldn't gauge his ethnicity, honestly. He had a black backpack on that looked like it was stuffed to the brim with God knows what. He awkwardly lingers in the cereal aisle for a minute, apparently looking at the granola bars. Then he came a little closer to me and asked me where the bread is. I pointed him in the right direction. He said thanks, and slowly walked away out of the aisle. I watched him walk away, and he had a very noticeable waddle in his walk. When he was out of sight, he was out of mind, though. The problem was that he wasn't out of sight for long. I was in the cereal aisle for quite some time, and I started noticing that every few minutes that guy would slowly pass by the aisle, looking down in this direction. He wasn't holding anything. He didn't get any bread. He just had on his big, sketchy backpack. I started working faster just so I could finish this aisle and move away from him. When I was done, I brought the empty UO platform back to the warehouse, where I grabbed another UBO full of boxes ready to stock. I purposely picked an aisle far away from the cereal aisle. I was now in the chips aisle. This is also about 45 minutes after initial contact with that guy, so there should have been no way he was still here, but I was wrong. He found me. I was rotating the newer bags of chips behind the older ones on the shelf, and then I looked to my right, and that guy was at the end of the aisle, creeping again. He still had nothing in his hands. This man had been creeping around the store for almost an hour. He then finally approached me, as I was dreading he would. I tried to look away until he started to speak. I don't remember word for word what he said, but basically, he said that he's been checking me out, and he couldn't resist coming up to me, telling me how beautiful I am. I responded as politely as I could. I did a fake little laugh and said, "No, thank you. That's very sweet." He didn't stop there, though. He asked a bunch of personal questions like where I'm from. I gave fake answers to everything. This guy absolutely reeked, and his breath was awful. I was genuinely repulsed. He asked for my number, and I said I'm seeing someone. He said there's nothing wrong with us just being friends. To get him to leave me alone, I gave him a fake number. I then told him I really can't be talking to anyone while I'm working. He made some creepy comment before walking away, thinking he was all suave that he got my number, when in reality he was genuinely creepy, and I gave him a fake number. I thought that would be the end of it. Hours went by, and time felt like it was going in reverse. I wanted to go home. Then the only other stock worker on the job at that hour suddenly walkie-talkie to me, saying there's some creepy-looking guy asking for me. I said, "Oh no," and then told her to tell him I left. I then basically made a beeline for the employee lounge, where I planned on hiding for a while. I made it to the lounge and then sat in one of the seats. Then the double doors opened, and in came that guy. He looked at me, and he looked angry. He yelled, "You gave me a fake number, you..." I think I swallowed my gum out of fear. I said, "You can't be back here, sir." He then took off his backpack and plopped it on the table next to mine. He started unzipping it as he looked at me. That's when it was time for me to go. I got up and ran past him without thinking. He tried to grab my arm, but he failed as I ran through the store. I looked back and saw he was running after me. I ran to the front of the store and outside to my car. It was the only thing I could think to do in the moment. Alternatively, I could have tried finding the male warehouse workers in the back, or even the manager, but that was no guarantee. I got to my car and saw the man leave the Walmart looking for me. He was slow. He must have been on something. He saw my car, but it was too late. I was already driving away. I called the night manager and let him know what just went down and that I'm not comfortable staying there tonight. I also warned him of the man with a backpack full of unknown contents. My manager told me I can't leave the place short-staffed. He said he'd call the police to make sure the man doesn't come back, and he told me I need to come back. I was adamant about not returning that night, though he eventually got the message and said he'd review the camera footage, but that I need to come back tomorrow night. And I did. He allegedly notified the police the next day of the man and gave the police department the surveillance footage. I met a lot of characters working that job, but this guy was by far the scariest. I don't know what he was reaching for in his backpack, and I don't want to either. I've always loved the movies. As a film fan, my attention would instantly snap to the TV when I caught a commercial for an upcoming movie. Most of the mindless, overproduced garbage Hollywood churns out is pretty forgettable, so whenever I discovered an indie film with a relatively fresh concept, I was excited to see something different. Recently, I caught a commercial for an upcoming limited-release thriller called Quiet Room, which I found pretty intriguing. The story features a serial killer with twisted sense of morality who picks his victims based on what he feels they add or detract from society, and his killing methods reflect how they've hurt others around them. I've only seen 2 different TV spots for this movie. Both were pretty similar, with just slightly different narration and video. However, one night while watching SportsCenter, I saw a new TV spot for Quiet Room that I'd never seen before, and I found it to be absolutely chilling. It opened with the title in white text on a black background, which it displayed for about 5 seconds. That led to second screen of similar text, which simply said, "I'm coming," centered on the screen. The text was accompanied by the sound of several people quietly sobbing. Upon looking closer, I could make out about 6 dark silhouettes of people in the background. There were no film clips in this spot, nor was there a "coming soon to theaters" message. I found this to be pretty unsettling, but probably a viral marketing tactic, so I watched some cartoons to settle my mind so I could get to sleep. The next day, I ran into my friend Jeff, and we decided to have lunch together. Our conversation eventually led to this bizarre and creepy commercial I saw during SportsCenter. I was shocked to hear that Jeff had also been watching SportsCenter last night, but didn't see the same commercial. Instead, he saw one of the original TV spots. I protested and described it in detail, but he had no clue what I was talking about. Naturally, this left me a little rattled regarding what I saw, but a few days elapsed, and I found myself settling back into my normal routine, which included my daily SportsCenter fix. The disturbing commercial had nearly escaped my mind before I saw it again. It seemed the same as before, however, everything seemed to be intensified. The wailing was louder, and the dark figures were easily recognizable this time. After collecting my thoughts for a few moments, I quickly called Jeff to ask if he had seen it this time, but again he replied no and hung up, probably thinking this is just a prank. My mind started to lose focus, and I began to doubt what I saw and heard. I went to the kitchen and made myself a snack, watched some more cartoons in the living room to help ease my mind, which didn't really help this time, and decided it was time to try to get some sleep. I made my way to my bedroom, and I was strangely able to find sleep quite easily. In the middle of the night, I woke from my sleep. I swore I could hear something odd, but couldn't make it out. The unsettling thoughts of quiet room came rushing back into my brain, instantly putting me on edge. I settled down and tried pinpoint this noise, thinking it was all in my head. It seemed to be the sound of intense wailing, exactly as I had heard it through the TV. Intense panic set in as I pulled the blanket over my head in an attempt to muffle the noise, but it only grew louder. The sadness of these beings saturated my mind. As I tried to block out these horrible voices, I noticed a shadow pass across my blanket, but I was too afraid to pull back the sheets to see if it was just a bird flying by my window or something sinister lurking inside my room. Suddenly, I felt something cold touch my toes from beneath the blanket, and I curled up into the fetal position in my bed, trembling with fear. A few moments pass before the blanket is ripped out of my grasp, and I can see what has entered my room. The image of a thick black figure stood at the side of my bed. There were no ears, nose, or eyes on its head. A wide, grinning mouth was its only defining feature. The urge to scream filled my mind, but nothing escaped my mouth. The creature seemed to soak up the terror I've become saturated with before it cocks, its head gently to the side, and thrusts a sharp, piercing claw into my chest. I managed to catch one last glimpse of the creature standing over me, as if utterly satisfied, before everything went silent and black. I woke up lying on the floor. I didn't know how much time had passed, but it was still obviously pitch black outside. I grasped my chest where I was attacked by the creature and found no wound and no blood. Normally, I would give a sigh of relief since I realized it was simply a nightmare, and I fell out of bed. But all I could feel was dread and intense sadness, the type of heartache you feel the moment you discover a loved one has died. I picked myself up and stumbled to the light switch, but I couldn't find it. The only light coming in was the window. As I examined it, it was far larger than normal and looked otherwise abnormal. As I approached it, I could see words written on it in reverse. It said, Gnimok Mul. Terror filled my mind as I realized what had happened. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I turned around to see 6 dark figures circled around me, crying intensely. The sense of sadness I initially felt increased exponentially, and I too began to cry uncontrollably. The light from the window was the only comfort in this horrible place, so I made my way towards the window so I could look out. The only thing I could see was my friend Jeff, sitting on his couch watching us. The rainy season began in early summer, and June had been no exception. It didn't surprise the man when he discovered rainwater dripping from his room ceiling. Shrugging it off, he placed a tall pot beneath the leak and expected it to stop on its own. However, it continued to rain, and before he knew it, the pot would threaten to overflow. He had to dump the water out first thing in the morning and straight after he returned home from work. Eventually, he began to notice water damage at the source of the leak. The white ceiling had discolored, turning a dull shade of brown. He checked the weather and realized that it would continue to rain sporadically over the next 10 days. The man was worried about the ceiling mildewing and becoming an expensive repair, so he called a local handyman. Fortunately, the man could not sign to have the repairs done. Only his landlord could. It was a frustrating policy. The man called his landlord but could not reach him. He left him a few voicemails detailing how the damage was becoming progressively worse. The man was clueless as to why his landlord would not return his calls. They usually kept in touch, speaking at least twice a month. Finally, he reasoned that he would not be held accountable for any damages sustained. One night, the man was startled awake by a massive thump. He quickly turned on his bedside lamp, and just vaguely, he could see an overturned table and a large shape laying across. He sprinted out of his apartment and called the police, gagging at the smell. The man sat in the police station with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a coffee mug resting in his hands. He did know one thing. There had been a dead body in his ceiling, and the water had saturated it so badly that it caved under the weight. So far, the body was unidentifiable due to the rainwater and was being autopsied. While the man waited, he called his landlord and finally reached him, panicking as he explained the situation. His landlord was just as alarmed, and the man pleaded for him to come to the station while he made his statement. The man paused as a detective crossed over to him. His blood ran immediately cold, and he shook his head with terror. The body belonged to Richard Thompson, his landlord, and he had died over a year ago. That's not what disturbed him the most. If his landlord was dead and who was pretending to be him,